You dare to say that Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization in front of everyone? Ibrahim Traoré's voice rang out firmly, cutting through the ancestral columns of the Sheldonian theatre like a blade slicing through dense, heavy silence. The video of that moment not only went viral within minutes, but became one of the greatest symbols of a historic turning point in the teaching of the humanities. The day an African president alone dismantled centuries of entrenched prejudice in Western academia. On that cold March afternoon, over 500 academics and students gathered at the University of Oxford for the highly anticipated conference on the foundations of modern civilization. The atmosphere, imbued with the subtle scent of ancient wood and the invisible weight of tradition, was the perfect setting for what seemed to be just another solemn lecture. However, no one could have predicted that from there would emerge a confrontation etched into the history of humanity. Professor Edmund Harrington, a distinguished scholar of European history, decorated and respected for his extensive work on the cultural supremacy of the West, approached the podium with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and never challenged. His speech, steeped in erudition, proceeded as expected until, in a dramatic and confident gesture, he uttered the phrase that would shake the world: "Africa has not been a contributor to human civilization. It was and always will be a passive recipient of others' culture." At that moment, as if time had frozen, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, slowly rose from his seat in the front row. He wore a simple, unpretentious dark blue suit. His gaze was calm but unrelenting. The entire audience held their breath, knowing that this man, a symbol of a rising Africa, would not let the provocation go unanswered. "Professor Harrington," Traoré began without resorting to a microphone, his voice filling every corner of the Baroque dome with an authority no academic title could surpass. "You have just repeated one of the greatest fallacies that have sustained centuries of domination and cultural erasure." The professor, initially taken aback, soon smirked with disdain, adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses and clasping his hands over the podium as if preparing to witness yet another passionate but feeble defense. The audience, torn between curiosity and tension, remained still while several phones discreetly began recording what would become the most resounding public downfall in recent academic history. "Let us turn to the facts, Professor," Traoré continued, opening an aged leather folder he carried with him. "Are you familiar by chance with the Lebombo bone? Found in present-day Eswatini, dated to over 44,000 years ago, with markings of lunar counting, evidencing the oldest mathematical system ever recorded. Mathematics was born in Africa, Professor. Not in Pythagorean schools, not in Alexandria under Greek rule, but here, among the peoples Your Excellency insists on calling passive recipients." Harrington let out a muffled chuckle, leaning slightly forward. "Rudimentary markings, tribal counts, hardly comparable to the rigor of Greek thought, I presume," he retorted with cold irony. Traoré remained unfazed. On the contrary, he raised another document, printed on thick paper. "And what of the Ishango bone, discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo, dated to at least 20,000 years ago? It bears clear evidence of multiplication and division, the conscious use of prime numbers. Before any Greek ever contemplated the word arithmetic, Africans were already performing complex calculations." The tension in the theatre grew with each sentence. Several professors, previously condescending, now exchanged uneasy glances. The Vice-Chancellor himself, seated discreetly to the right of the stage, brought his hand to his chin as if contemplating the magnitude of what was unfolding. Traoré, sensing the impact, pressed on. "You cited German philosophy as a pillar of modern thought, yet you ignore Zera Jacob, the 17th-century Ethiopian philosopher who wrote treatises on reason, ethics, and human rights, texts that predate by decades the Enlightenment ideas the West so proudly claims. Why is he not mentioned in European philosophical compendiums, Professor?" Harrington opened his mouth but said nothing. His eyes, once defiant, now sought refuge in the disorganized notes on the podium. "Your Excellency exalts Roman law but is unaware, or prefers to ignore, the constitution of the Ashanti Confederation in present-day Ghana, with a system of checks and balances that would inspire any scholar of governance centuries before Europe's bourgeois revolutions." The murmurs in the audience grew. Many African students, who until then had shrunk back, intimidated by Harrington's imposing figure, now sat up straighter in their seats, scribbling down each reference Traoré cited with surgical precision. Maintaining his composure, Traoré took a few steps toward the center of the stage, closer to the professor. "And if we speak of medicine, Professor, while Europe practiced bloodletting and medical superstitions, surgeons in Mali were performing cataract operations as early as the 14th century, with success rates recorded in manuscripts preserved to this day in Timbuktu, a city that in the 12th century housed the University of Sankore, with over 25,000 students and hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, while Oxford was little more than a scattered collection of monasteries." A murmur of surprise and admiration rippled through the audience. The name Sankore echoed like a revelation to many, a product of systematic silencing. "Isn't it curious," Traoré continued, "that so many are surprised to learn that Africa has a millennia-old academic legacy, systematically concealed by Eurocentric narratives?" Harrington, now visibly disconcerted, rubbed the palm of his right hand against his forehead, as if trying to dispel the cold sweat that persisted, despite the theater's mild temperature. Traoré then turned to the audience, his eyes sweeping over the astonished faces of students, professors, and administrators. "When the lie that Africa did not contribute to human civilization is perpetuated, it is not merely a historical injustice. It fuels a cycle of ignorance, racism, and cultural subjugation." He then faced Harrington directly. "You, with your 3 honorary chairs and 12 published books, should be a guardian of historical truth, yet you choose to be complicit in a convenient fiction." The silence that settled over the theater after these words was so thick it seemed unbreakable, until a single clap from the back of the audience rang out like a spark of liberation, followed by others, until the entire Sheldonian erupted in a unanimous standing ovation. With a slight nod, Traoré calmly gathered his papers, closed his leather folder, and made to leave. But first he addressed Harrington one last time. "Professor, I will leave copies of the manuscripts and primary sources I cited at your department's disposal. I sincerely hope you read them, not to prove me wrong, but to set yourself free." Professor Harrington remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some undefined point on the marble floor. For the first time in his career, the oratory that had so often elevated him at international conferences failed him completely. Eloquence now belonged to another man, another voice, and the weight of a truth long buried under the rubble of selective historiography. As the audience continued to applaud, several academics stood, not only to cheer Ibrahim Traoré, but as a symbolic gesture of breaking with the exclusionary paradigm that had, until then, dominated Western academic institutions. Among them stood out Professor Mary Whitfield, head of the Department of African Studies, who approached the stage and took the microphone with a voice choked with emotion. "President Traoré," she said slowly, acknowledging for the first time before that audience the true authority present, "on behalf of this university I apologize." The theater, struck with awe, fell into absolute silence as Whitfield continued. "Your words expose not only the ignorance of one professor, but the systemic failure of an institution that for centuries has neglected the intellectual, scientific, and philosophical contributions of the African continent. I commit before all to revising this university's history curriculum." The professor's statement further highlighted the contrast with Harrington's diminished figure, who, without the strength even to argue, merely gathered his papers, now as devoid of substance as the words he had uttered moments before with such arrogance. Traoré, for his part, remained calm, with the same serene dignity that characterized his entire speech. He refused any gesture of triumph or humiliation. Approaching Whitfield, he shook her hand and, turning to the audience once more, spoke again, not to rebut but to propose, "What happened here today should not be seen as one man's defeat or another's victory. This is, above all, a historic opportunity to rewrite together the narrative of humanity." The theater erupted in a new round of applause, this time longer, warmer, more aware of what that scene represented, not only the collapse of an icon of Eurocentric academia, but the awakening of a new era, a new intellectual posture, more honest, more inclusive, more faithful to the truth of the facts. The next morning, images of the intellectual clash between Ibrahim Traoré and Professor Harrington had already taken over social media and news outlets worldwide. Headlines like, "African President Dismantles Centuries of Prejudice at Oxford," and "The Fall of Eurocentrism, the Speech That Made History," graced the covers of major international newspapers. The video, shared by millions, not only reignited debates about the role of universities in perpetuating exclusionary narratives, but also triggered a chain reaction in various academic institutions. Departments and chairs dedicated to African studies saw their enrollments skyrocket. Researchers previously marginalized became central voices in revising and expanding history and philosophy curricula. African manuscripts, once ignored and left to gather dust in rarely consulted libraries, became the subject of conferences, symposia, and interdisciplinary research. But perhaps the most emblematic outcome was the announcement, made by the University of Oxford itself, a few days after the episode. The creation of a new annual lecture series titled African Contributions to World Civilization, aimed at revisiting and reclaiming the intellectual, scientific, and philosophical legacy of the African continent, long silenced. The first invited speaker, naturally Ibrahim Traoré, who initially reluctant accepted the invitation on one condition, that a public tribute be paid to Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the great 16th century African scholar whose works continue to illuminate human thought to this day. And so it was. A year after that memorable confrontation, the University of Oxford unveiled a statue of Ahmed Baba in its central courtyard. The ceremony brought together political leaders, intellectuals, and thousands of students. The inscription at the base of the statue read, "Knowledge has no color. Wisdom knows no boundaries. Truth belongs to all humanity." The impact of the episode reverberated far beyond the walls of academia. In high schools in Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar, and even Paris, London, and New York, teachers began their history lessons with conviction. Human civilization began in Africa. And yet, Ibrahim Traoré, when interviewed months later, revealed an even deeper perspective on the event. "I didn't go to Oxford intending to make a speech. I went to participate in a symposium, like any other invited head of state. But when I heard Professor Harrington's words, I immediately thought of the African children who every day are taught to doubt themselves. I thought of the young people who grow up believing their history begins and ends with slavery, colonization, exploitation." He paused briefly, looking at the camera with the same serenity that marked his historic speech. "I couldn't remain silent, not for myself, not for personal pride, but for them, for all those who for centuries have been silenced." The interviewer then asked if he didn't think his intervention had been, in some way, too harsh on an aging professor nearing retirement. Traoré shook his head slowly. "The harshness isn't in my response. The harshness lies in the fact that, for 47 years, Harrington perpetuated a lie. This isn't about an inadvertent mistake. It's about a deliberate choice to remain ignorant, to protect privileges, to refuse to acknowledge the value of an essential part of humanity." With a steady gaze, he concluded, "The real violence isn't the confrontation with the truth. The real violence is erasure, the systematic theft of entire people's cultural dignity." The episode became known as the Traoré moment. In academic conferences, it became a mandatory reference in discussions on the decolonization of knowledge and epistemologies of the South. The term took on a life of its own, symbolizing any courageous rupture with power structures that insist on maintaining exclusionary narratives. Inspired by the episode, numerous universities began revising their bibliographies, incorporating works by African thinkers, black historians, and intellectuals who had, until then, been relegated to footnotes. Afro-descendant students around the world reported feeling, for the first time, truly represented in the content they studied. And Professor Harrington, in a letter released shortly before his early retirement, he wrote, "Throughout my career, I blindly trusted traditional historiography without ever questioning the voices that were silenced." Ibrahim Traoré's speech was not just a critique of me, but an undeniable call for intellectual honesty. "I leave this university not as a defeated man, but as someone who, though late, learned the importance of humility in the face of the complexity of human history." In the streets of Ouagadougou, young people raised banners with Traoré's image and the inscription, "Our history, our dignity." In Lagos, a student march was organized in support of the global movement to value African heritage, while in South African universities, new chairs dedicated to researching African contributions to science, philosophy, and the arts emerged. It was no longer just about a speech or a discredited professor. It was a true intellectual renaissance. reigniting in the heart of humanity the understanding that no civilization stands alone, that all cultures are indispensable pieces in the great mosaic of human progress. For Ibrahim Traoré, that episode was not an end but a starting point. When asked what he most wished to accomplish after such a feat, he responded with a discreet smile, to keep speaking, to keep teaching, because silence is complicity, and we have already been silent for too long. The Sheldonian Theatre, the stage of the confrontation, stands there still, imposing and silent, a stone witness to the day the truth finally found its voice. Today, years after that moment, schools, universities, and research centers worldwide recognize that the history of human civilization is not the exclusive property of one continent or people, but the sum of all cultures, legacies, and achievements. Ibrahim Traoré's name has become synonymous with intellectual courage and historical justice. The silence that hung over Oxford that afternoon marked not only the end of an era of exclusion, but the beginning of a new era, where truth, however uncomfortable, will always find someone to defend it with dignity and conviction.